Hi, my name is Tananarive. I am an author and screenwriter. I'm an executive producer on Shudder's Horror Noir, and I teach a Black horror class at UCLA called The Sunken Place: Racism, Survival, and the Black Horror Aesthetic. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the history of Black horror films. So my love for horror, like a lot of Black women I know, started at a young age because my mother loved horror. My late mother was a civil rights activist. She was my first shero and in fact had a tear gas canister thrown in her face. So she wore dark glasses the whole time I knew her as an adult. I mention that because my mother suffered trauma. I began to realize that my mother was using horror movies as a way to soothe her trauma and anger and fear out of not just the civil rights movement, but racial trauma in the United States. Something pretty extraordinary happened in very recent years. Jordan Peele released his Oscar-winning screenplay, but the film was called Get Out, which was a Black horror story by a Black creator, a Black story told through a Black lens, which was very different than the horror that I had been seeing up to that point. It's a really, really exciting time to be a horror creator and a horror fan, and I am personally seeing the impact of that. But it has been a long road to this point. This is not where we started. So I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about the history of Black horror and film so we can all have a better idea of how significant it is that we are where we are today. So when we look at the history of Black horror films and Blacks in horror films, Dr. Robin Armeens Coleman in her book Horror Noir does make a distinction between Black horror, which is Black created and Black driven horror, and Blacks in horror, which is non-Black creators where often we are ill-used. Let's look at something that you might not even consider a horror film, The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's film, which was the first Hollywood blockbuster. It reigned in movie theaters as like the top box office for all intents and purposes a generation. It was the most popular film in the country, and unfortunately encoded in that film is some very toxic imagery and some very toxic propaganda propping up the Confederacy, and even worse than that, the Ku Klux Klan. So the remnants of the Confederacy, which are these masked Avengers, basically whites dressed up in hoods. This was popularized in the burning of the crosses, and all of this became sort of a template for how domestic terrorism could look. But for moviegoers who were not Black, this was not considered domestic terrorism. This was just justice. This was the natural order. So starting in 1915 with The Birth of a Nation, that would be Blacks in horror, although a lot of them weren't even Black. It was just white actors in blackface. But that was showcasing Black monstrosity. They're gonna rise up, they're gonna steal your women, they're gonna take your jobs or whatever. And we're still sort of under the cloud of that propaganda from 1915 today in many ways as we've tried to move away from those stereotypes. So then jump ahead to the 1940s, where finally filmmaker Spencer Williams wrote Son of Ngagi, the first Black science fiction horror film, which is Black driven, Black characters, doctor, lawyer, weddings, all kinds of middle class respectability to try to counteract all those stereotypes. You can contrast that to the movie that came out a year later, 1941, King of the Zombies, starring MANTAN Moreland. This is comic horror. MANTAN Moreland was very well known, terrific performer, but unfortunately spent a lot of his time having to make buggy eyes and Feet Don't Fail Me Now, and the Black, have to be saved by the white man. So this is a battle, two sides trying to tell the story of Blacks in horror. Moving beyond the 40s, we disappeared a great deal in the 50s. By the time you get to the 60s, there's the breakout performance of Dwayne Jones in Night of the Living Dead. He won the role of the protagonist, Ben. Ben ends up in a room, basically with this white woman, Barbara. They're coming
to get you, Barbara.
That line. So Ben ends up with Barbara. Barbara's in shock. At one point, she slaps him. He hits her back in 1968. And to have a Black protagonist, not only the alpha and in charge of all this group of characters in the house, but killing all these white zombies, I'm thinking that looked pretty disturbing to racist moviegoers in particular. Whereas Black moviegoers are like, what is going on here? Oh my gosh, so exciting. The 1970s is the growth of the BLAXPLOITATION era. This is when Black filmmakers were having an opportunity to really tell their own version of a horror story. So instead of Dracula, you get BLAXPLOITATION. William Crane directed this. He's a very young director. He took it in a direction that the filmmakers, the studio wasn't really comfortable with, adding African history, and he has his characters that their names are in Swahili, but the filmmaker was trying to elevate the material above what we had seen previously. So the 1970s saw the gamut of Black horror from Black creators, where in a film like Abby, it's a Black woman who's possessed by sort of a sex demon. Again, not always the best messages, but at least was an opportunity for Black filmmakers to show themselves in film and to move beyond the worst stereotypes that we had seen in previous eras. So the 1980s were the double-edged sword of representation. Like, yay, there's more of us in the films, but because the financing models had moved away from the blaxploitation era where films were just going to show in Black neighborhoods for Black audiences, once you sort of globalize movie making, that's when you start to see those parts really shrinking for the Black characters and becoming tropey. So your background characters, your sassy characters, you're gonna die. If you're not dying first, you're definitely gonna die second or third. You're generally not going to make it until the end of the movie. And we start to see more of those stereotypes of the magical Negro, the sacrificial Negro, the spiritual guide emerging in the 80s. So the magical Negro is that character, often characterized as other. Usually you're the only person of color in the movie, and you're the one with all the answers. You're the character the white characters go to for all their magical needs. The sacrificial Negro is that character who will throw him or herself in harm's way, literally jump in front of the monster to save the white characters. Some of the most obvious examples of those tropes showing up in films in the 80s are The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's Shining in 1980, where Dick Halloran, the character played by Scatman Crothers, who survives in Stephen King's novel, actually ends up getting an axe in the chest the minute he walks through the door by Jack Nicholson. In the film version, classic sacrificial Negro. The early 2000s and 2001 had an example of a magical Negro in the film Jeepers Creepers, where again, a Black woman is showing up pretty randomly to give advice and putting herself at risk to try to save the white characters and convince them that she knows about the creature that's stalking them. Luckily, she does survive, but she came this close to being a sacrificial Negro too. The 90s were an amazing film renaissance all through film, including horror. So you had directors getting opportunities to tell their stories. Rusty Cundiff, Tales from the Hood really stands out from 1995. 4 short horror stories, a lot of them revenge-oriented, a lot of them sometimes a plea for the Black community to do better within its homes or within its communities, but also lots of payback for evil racist cops or for racist politicians. Beyond Tales from the Hood, there's also Casey Lemon's beautiful film, Eve's Bayou, which is mostly a drama, but it has tinges of voodoo, and the horror is in the home. It's the story of young Eve and her coming of age and really loss of innocence as she begins to wonder if her philandering father, played by Samuel Jackson, might have had inappropriate contact with her sister, and she believes that she created a voodoo spell to kill him. Contrasting that would be the 1990s version of Candyman, which was not by a Black filmmaker, although it did star the iconic actor Tony Todd as Candyman, and I've talked to Tony Todd, and I know that that role was a sense of pride for a lot of young Blacks, especially probably young Black men who saw him as strong and powerful and in charge of his own destiny. But civil rights groups were not happy at the time of the idea of a Black serial killer, basically, which is what Candyman was, especially I think because he was plaguing his own community, the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago. So even though Candyman's backstory was that he had basically been mauled and killed by racists because of his love for a white woman, when he comes back, he's attacking a Black housing project. Candyman was considered problematic in its day, although it really does still stand out as one of the iconic horror films. We also started to see the emergence of Black women in horror in bigger roles. Alien vs. Predator came out, and Sanaa Lathan is a badass. Am I allowed to say that? In 2002, R&B star AALIYAH was in Queen of the Damned, and in not the lead role, but a great role, so nice representation. We're starting to see it just a little bit more, but it's also just sprinkles here and there. So with this sort of hit and miss history, there wasn't really a congealed idea of what Black horror was going into the 2010s until Jordan Peele created Get Out, which has just opened the door and opened imaginations so that people like me who create horror and people who are just fans of horror finally have an opportunity to just be like everybody else, whether it's about race or not about race. So Get Out, obviously racism is the monster. Us, the follow-up to Get Out, not so much. It's more about class, although it is still revolutionary that Peele intentionally cast that movie with Black actors. First of all, horror is like any other film genre in the sense that representation matters. Our films, as a culture, should look like our nation. This is kind of a no-brainer, but it's been a long journey. They can learn to empathize with us and yell and scream on our behalf, and that's in us and other marginalized groups and queer characters. There's room for everybody. I think as a culture, we all just need to learn how to see the humanity in each other. And I'm just really grateful that we've reached the time when we can show more of our full measure of humanity on film. All this to say, especially all of you creators out there, don't listen to the naysayers who tell you don't waste your time writing horror or writing science fiction. There has never been a better time to be a Black horror creator, and I can't wait to see the stories you'll tell.